My name is Vera, and the smell of chrysanthemums still makes my chest tighten. Because the last time I stood in a room full of them, my stepmother unfolded a piece of paper in front of 60 people and read a will that erased me completely. She stood there in her black silk blouse, composed and deliberate, and told my father's oldest friends, his colleagues, his sister, and every person who had ever loved him, that he had chosen to leave me nothing. Not the house I grew up in, not the savings he had built over 40 years, not even the architectural library he had spent his entire career assembling, one annotated drawing at a time. Just a pocket watch and a single line about gratitude and understanding. I sat in the second row and felt the room look at me. And I let them look. Because at the bottom of my bag, under my keys and my phone and a folded receipt, from the gas station where I had stopped 4 hours earlier, was an envelope my father had handed me 2 years before he died. He had looked at me across his drafting table and said, "You will know when." And sitting in that church hall with the chrysanthemums and the folding chairs and the lukewarm coffee, I knew. My father, Leonard, was an architect who spent 40 years building other people's dreams. He was the kind of man who remembered your birthday but forgot to eat lunch, who drove 3 hours to watch me graduate and never once mentioned it again because he didn't believe in making people feel observed. He raised me alone after my mother left when I was 4, and for most of my childhood it was just the two of us, and his drafting table and a kitchen that always smelled like burnt toast because neither of us had ever learned to cook properly and neither of us particularly cared. We were happy in the uncomplicated way that people are when they don't need much from each other beyond presence. He met Claudette when I was 19. She was polished in the way that requires money and sustained effort. The kind of woman who owns 7 pairs of the same shoes in different colors and calls it efficiency. I tried to like her. I tried for years. But Claudette had a way of quietly rewriting things. The stories she told about my father's life before her were always slightly off. His preferences shifted. Old friends stopped calling. I noticed and said nothing, because my father seemed content, and I told myself that was enough. They married when I was 21. By 24, I had moved to another city. My visits home became shorter and further apart. Not because I had stopped loving him, but because being in that house felt like reading a book where someone had gone in and changed all the chapter titles while leaving the pages intact. My father was diagnosed with a heart condition 3 years ago. Nothing immediately fatal, but something that required medication and monitoring, and a pace that was slower than the one he had kept for most of his life. I flew home the week I found out and spent 10 days on the couch of the house. I grew up in watching him do the crossword in his pajamas and pretending we weren't both aware that something had shifted. On the last night before I flew back, he asked me to come into his study. He closed the door, which he almost never did. He sat across from me at the drafting table and told me he had been doing some thinking. He said he loved Claudette, but that he also knew people, and that he had learned things over the years about how grief can make people act in ways that surprise you. He told me he wanted to make sure I was protected. He slid a sealed envelope across the table and said, "Don't open this. Keep it somewhere safe. You will know when." He asked me not to tell Claudette. I promised him I wouldn't. I kept that promise for 2 years. I kept the envelope in a fireproof box in my apartment closet under a stack of old tax documents. I thought about it sometimes. Late at night, wondered what was inside. Whether I was being dramatic for keeping it so carefully, whether my father had simply been in a dark mood that evening and would have laughed about it if I had brought it up later. But every time I came close to opening it, I remembered the way he looked at me when he slid it across the table. Calm, certain, like a man who has finished a very long calculation and arrived at an answer he doesn't enjoy but fully accepts. So I left it sealed. He died on a Tuesday in October. Not dramatically. He simply didn't wake up. His heart had been quietly struggling for 3 years, and one morning it decided it was finished. Claudette called me at 6 in the morning. Her voice was steady and her words were efficient. She told me the arrangements were already being handled. She told me the funeral would be Saturday. She told me I was welcome to attend. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and repeated those words back to myself. Welcome to attend my father's funeral, as though I were a neighbor who had admired him from a reasonable distance. I drove 8 hours straight. I arrived the night before the service and knocked on the door of the house where I had learned to ride a bike. Claudette opened it in a silk blouse and reading glasses and told me the guest room had been converted into a home office and that I would, need to find a hotel. I stood on that porch for a moment and looked at her. Then I went and booked a room down the street. The morning of the funeral, I opened my closet and took out the fireproof box. I sat on the edge of the hotel, bed with the curtains still closed, and opened the envelope for the first time. Inside were 3 documents paper-clipped together. The first was my father's original will, dated 7 years ago, notarized, leaving the house and his savings and his architectural library equally between me and Claudette. The second was a letter in my father's handwriting. He had heard from a family friend, someone in Claudette's social circle who had felt uncomfortable staying quiet, that Claudette had consulted an estate attorney the previous year about the process of amending a will without a spouse's direct involvement. My father had not confronted her. He had instead made arrangements, quietly, carefully, the way he did everything. The third document was a signed affidavit from the original notary, confirming the will's authenticity and the date of execution. I read all 3 documents twice. Then I placed them back in the envelope and put the envelope in my bag and got dressed for my father's funeral. The service was beautiful in the way that prepared things sometimes are. Flowers he would have found excessive. A eulogy from a man who had met him twice. I sat in the second row because Claudette's adult children, from her first marriage, occupied the front. I held myself together through the hymns and the readings and through the slideshow, which contained 4 photographs of me out of 37 total. I counted. I am not sure why I counted, but I did. At the reception in the church hall, Claudette stood and tapped her glass. She thanked everyone for coming. She spoke about my father for 3 minutes and about herself for 6. And then she said there was something important she needed to address. Something Leonard had wanted handled promptly and clearly, to avoid confusion or conflict in the family. She unfolded a document and began to read. According to the will she held, my father had left the house and all its contents to Claudette, his savings and investment accounts to Claudette, his architectural archives, 40 years of work, to Claudette, and to me, his only biological child, a single line, a request that I receive his pocket watch as a personal keepsake and his gratitude for my understanding. The room was very quiet. I could feel people looking at me. My aunt, my father's older sister, had gone completely still in the chair beside me. 2 of his oldest friends, men who had known him since university, were staring at the table. Someone coughed. Claudette folded the document and looked at me with an expression that was almost sympathetic. She said she knew this might be difficult to hear, but that she wanted to honor Leonard's wishes exactly as he had expressed them. I let her finish. I let the silence sit for exactly 5 seconds. Then I reached into my bag. I placed the envelope on the table in front of me and said calmly that I had also brought something my father had wanted handled promptly and clearly. I asked if anyone present had a legal background. My father's friend David, who had been an estate attorney for 30 years before retiring, raised his hand slowly from across the room. I walked the envelope to him. I watched him open it. I watched him read the first document, then the second, then the third. I watched his expression move from curiosity to recognition to something quiet and final. He looked up at me. He looked at Claudette. He looked back at the papers. He said, clearly enough for the tables nearest to him to hear, that what he was holding appeared to be a properly notarized will, predating the document. Claudette had just read, accompanied by a notarial affidavit confirming its authenticity. He said that in his professional opinion, if the dates and signatures held under scrutiny, the document Claudette had presented might not be the legally operative will. Claudette's composure collapsed so fast it was almost startling. One moment she was controlled and poised. The next she was standing, saying the papers were fabricated, that I had always been resentful, that my father had warned her I would try something like this. Her voice climbed and her hands were shaking. Nobody in that room moved to support her. Nobody spoke in her defense. The silence around her was complete. My aunt stood up from her chair. She was 71 years old and had known my father his entire life. She looked at Claudette and said, with the stillness of someone who has nothing left to fear, that my father had called her 2 years ago and told her he had updated his arrangements, that he had said Vera knows, That he had said he hoped it would never be necessary, but that he felt better, knowing it was in place. The room shifted in the way that rooms do when the story everyone has been told turns out to be wrong. I could feel the weight of it redistributing. I did not say anything else that afternoon. I did not need to. Within 2 weeks, the will Claudette had presented was under investigation. Within 6 weeks, forensic document analysis confirmed the signatures were inconsistent with my father's authenticated handwriting. Within 4 months, probate court recognized my father's original will as the legally valid document. The house came to me, his savings, divided as he had always intended. His library, 40 years of drawings and notes and annotated references, came home with me in 17 boxes that I spent 3 weekends unpacking. People ask me if I wish I had opened the envelope earlier. I used to think yes. Now I think no. My father understood structure. He knew that some things only hold together if you don't disturb them before they are needed. He built the thing that would protect me, and he trusted me to keep it safe until the moment arrived. That was his way of loving me quietly, precisely, without ever needing to announce it. If you have ever been handed something you didn't fully understand and told simply to keep it safe until you know, trust that. And if someone has stood in a room full of people and told you that you are getting nothing after a lifetime of being someone's everything, know this. The truth does not require a loud entrance. It only requires patience and documentation and the willingness to reach into your bag at exactly the right moment and place it on the table. My name is Vera. My father built things that lasted. So did I. If this story stayed with you, subscribe now, because there are more stories here about people who were told they were getting nothing and what happened when they finally decided to speak.